Hello, and welcome to the Geocurrents series on the historical geography of natural psychoactive substances. Today's lecture is part one of Eurasian hallucinogens. The main hallucinogenic substances of Eurasia are two fungi and four closely related plants. The fungi are Amanita muscaria, or fly agaric, as it's sometimes said, and ergot, the latter of which is a um, fungus that grows on grain, particularly rye. And then there are four plants, all closely related: henbane, mandrake, nightshade, and datura, or Jimson weed. This lecture will look at amanita and the ancient and medicinal uses of henbane, mandrake, nightshade, and datura. We'll talk about the um, ritual, or if you will, recreational uses of those substances in the next lecture. I've shown this Venn diagram of mind-altering substances several times before. It's quite useful, although there are some problems with it, so I've made some edits to it. So I'm looking at that the bottom circle, hallucinogens, as they're generally called, substances that can cause or do cause hallucinations. In here we can see ergot, which is actually related to LSD, and definitely in the hallucinogenic category, but also going a bit into the stimulant category. We can see the deliriants at the bottom of the hallucinogenic category without any overlap. And Amanita, or fly agaric, has been put in the same position here. I put an arrow, though, because it does have a certain stimulant and depressant quality. So I think, well, it's a very difficult drug to categorize. And actually, many of these drugs are difficult to categorize because there are overlapping categories. It depends on dose and, well, it depends on many other things as well. But the general categorization of hallucinogens puts them in three different main groups: psychedelics, deliriants, and dissociatives. Psychedelics are drugs that cause an apparent expansion of consciousness. I'll talk about that in greater detail later on. But they're also associated with what are sometimes called lucid hallucinations, which means there's a general awareness that the hallucination is not real. So examples of this would be peyote, psilocybin, LSD, and plants with DMT, as well as ergot. I'll talk about most of these substances when we get to the hallucinogens, or the, I should say, I'm sorry, hallucinogens of the Western Hemisphere of the Americas. We'll talk about ergot today, which is why I put it in red. Deliriants are quite different. With deliriants, you get delirium, a loss of rational thought, and very often a belief that the hallucinations are real, and very often people act on that assumption. So these would be the substances I'll be talking about today: datura, mandrake, nightshade, and henbane. Dissociatives are generally synthetics. Ketamine and PCP are the main ones that are used. So I won't talk about that because I'm not talking about synthetic substances in this lecture series. But anyway, dissociatives are associated with feelings of detachment from the environment and the self. They do or can cause hallucinations, as well as dreamlike states and anesthesia. So examples here for the natural ones, I put question marks because it's unclear in all these cases whether it's the best place to put them. Salvia divinorum, I'll talk about that a few lectures from now. Iboga, that's an African substance. I will briefly talk about that in the final lecture. Nutmeg, yeah, very popular spice, but if one eats an entire container of it, one will have very serious psychological effects, generally described as highly unpleasant, not to be advised. And then Amanita muscaria, which I'll talk about at some length. Now, quite a few scholars say that entheogen is the more appropriate term, that hallucinatory drugs or hallucinogens or psychedelics even are problematic. So just to quote from the Wikipedia article on this, entheogens are psychedelic drugs used for engendering spiritual development or otherwise used in sacred contexts. Carl Ruck et al. Argue that hallucinogen is inappropriate due to the etymological relationship to words relating to delirium and insanity, and psychedelics seen as problematic owing to similarities to words like psychosis. Well, those are important objections, and I can understand them. One problem, though, with using the term entheogen, which entails the belief that spiritual experiences, and in general, that positive spiritual experiences are engendered by these substances, is that sometimes that is the case, but sometimes all of these substances produce nightmare visions, terrifying experiences. That seems to be especially true with Datura or Jimson weed, something I will be talking about today to some extent, and I'll talk about it in subsequent lectures as well. What I have in this illustration are a couple little clips from a YouTube website that gives trip reports on people's experiences. And if you go and look at these on Datura, you'll find a lot of, 4 nightmarish Datura experiences, 5 terrifying Datura trips, or the last one, Datura trip report, 3 days of endless insanity. So Datura or Jimson weed seems to be particularly prone to create these kind of nightmare experiences, which most users say are anything but finding God or having a deep spiritual experience. And that's actually, to some extent, this is true of all hallucinogens. They can produce very positive experiences, but they can also produce very negative experiences. If you're interested in these trip reports, there are a lot of them on YouTube. The ultimate source is a website called Arrowwood, and you can see it. That's a huge website. People write in their own experiences. When I originally prepared this lecture, I spent a lot of time watching a number of these drugs. Well, most of them I had no experience with. They're very complicated experiences, and I wanted to get a good sense of it. So I spent quite a bit of time watching these. For a while, I think I was driving my wife crazy. I said, how can you watch those things? This is like hearing people talk about their dreams. But I did find them interesting, and I will occasionally go back to these Arrowwood trip reports to try to get some understanding of what's involved. And I will note that even Datura, for all of its nightmares, can result in positive experiences. So here we have again, one of these YouTube sites that reports these trip reports with interesting imagery. There's one here, surprisingly positive, and it's surprisingly because they're so often negative. So anyway, just a few general comments about hallucinogens and the hallucinogenic experience. That it certainly varies greatly by drug type and dose, like everything else. It also varies a lot from person to person and what is usually described as set and setting. Referring to the mindset of the individual and the environment in which the drug is taken. Sometimes euphoric, often dysphoric, usually very long lasting, many hours up to pretty much a day or so, with a couple of prominent exceptions. Salvia divinorum, seer's sage, I'll talk about that when we get to the Western Hemisphere, lasts about 15 minutes. DMT, when it's taken in its traditional form in ayahuasca, where it's mixed with other substances, is long-lasting, but if pure dimethyltryptamine or DMT is smoked or injected, which is a modern practice, it's very short-lasting, 15 minutes or so, but intense. I'll talk about that later on. All of these have low to non-existent addiction potential. These are, especially in moderate or high doses, are extreme experiences, and few people are eager to continue to go there. I mean, there have been some, but addiction is not really the right term. And long-term effects, well, I should say even short-term effects, are controversial in the medical and scientific literature. So let me start with Amanita muscaria, or the fly agaric, or agaric as it's sometimes said, sometimes pronounced. It is a close relative in the same genus as Amanita phalloides, the death cap, and it is poisonous, not as much as the death cap, but it is poisonous when fresh. When dried, it is just semi-toxic. but it's hallucinogenic, and that's how it's used. There are two main psychoactive components, muscimol and ibotenic acid. And muscimol is, ibotenic acid is metabolized into muscimol, but both of these drugs have effects on the user. And one reason why Amanita experiences vary so much is because of the different ratio of muscimol to ibotenic acid. So muscimol is a sedative hypnotic and considered to be a depressant. It definitely has hallucinogenic psychoactivity. Its biochemistry is pretty well known as an agonist of the GABA receptor, whereas ibotenic acid is a stimulant, so an opposite of muscimol in terms of stimulating or depressing the central nervous system. It's slightly toxic, so it does cause discomfort at first especially. And it's an agonist of the glutamate receptor, so different biochemical activity. And we can just see, I like to have these illustrations showing the receptors, just showing the complexity of the brain structure and the lock and key mechanism where the molecule has to fit precisely into those very complicated receptors. Muscimol definitely has medical uses, ameliorating nerve injury related to neuropathy, nerve damage. I just put up an article here, a summary of an article on this topic. If one wants to really get a detailed exploration of what the effects of Amanita muscaria are, I would recommend before you go, you could go into those trip reports, as I mentioned before, and get individual assessments, summaries of their own experiences. For a more scholarly approach to this, I highly recommend Andrew Sherratt's 1990s BBC series, documentary series called Sacred Weeds. He has 4 of these episodes, or 4 were made. And the first one was on Amanita muscaria, the fly agaric mushroom. Now, note on this video, you have always Andrew Sherratt himself, who's masterminded this, and you have 2 volunteers, people who take the substance. And then you have usually 3 academics, generally one who's a medical doctor who's going to be monitoring the subjects, and then anthropologists or psychiatrists, scholars of different fields who are interested in these effects. And they document the experience of the 2 volunteers, and then they discuss they discuss what has been seen, and they delve into the relevant literature on the topic, and they often debate each other, which is one thing that makes it very interesting to me. You can find these on YouTube for free. They're pretty poor quality, video quality, but they're pretty easily found, and I found them fascinating. And it's important to note who Andrew Sherratt was. He died at quite a young age, 59, in 2006, but he was a path-breaking British archaeologist, most noted for what is known as the secondary products revolution, where what Sherratt argued was that you had a Neolithic domestication of plants and animals, but then a few thousand years later you had the secondary products revolution, where those domesticated animals started to be used for more than their meat, used for milk, for wool, for traction, for riding, for transport, and so on. Very, very important work. And a delightful person, too. I really enjoy watching Andrew Sherratt. And again, if you're interested in more information on Amanita, I'd recommend going to the website of a woman who calls herself Amanita Explorer. It's a very large website. It has lots of information. She remains anonymous, but anyway, argues that Amanita saved her from benzodiazepine addiction. So this is synthetic substance very often prescribed for anxiety, panic attacks, and so on. So she had some psychological problems, started taking prescription drugs, well, one in particular, benzos, and ended up becoming addicted to that and having a lot of problems. And then she really, claims that Amanita saved her life. Take it with a grain of salt, as always. Amanita muscaria is widely spread in the northern hemisphere. This is a crude map I made. I can't vouch for its accuracy. It's difficult to get information. But the mushroom is a symbiont with pine, birch, and other northern trees, so it's a woodland mushroom species. Its tested traditional use is found in the red areas on this map in northern Eurasia among the Sami, or so-called Lap people of northern Scandinavia, in western Siberia, and in far eastern Siberia. I put an arrow from the Siberian Uralic peoples, the western ones of Siberia, because it's very difficult for me to figure out how far its traditional use expanded to the north. In that area with the arrow, the mushrooms are not going to grow. That's tundra, wrong ecosystem. But it doesn't mean it wasn't traded or moved into that area. In western Siberia and among the Sami, it seems to have been for shamans only, or shamans, religious ritual specialists. In eastern Siberia, it was for everyone, and is even to this day. It hasn't disappeared, but not always in a pleasant manner, and I'll give some information on that in a second. Now, there's this interesting gap, or really two gaps in this map. When you see a distribution map like that, you have to wonder, well, did it spread separately into these areas? Or was it at one time used across the larger area, and then other peoples moved into the areas in between and brought an end to its use? And it's probably the latter. It was probably used across northern Eurasia at one time. There's an interesting historical linguistic aspect to this. Traditional use is associated with the Uralic peoples in blue. Not all of them. No evidence that Hungarians or Finns or Estonians used it. But the smaller, more tribal groups among the Uralic peoples, from the Sami in northern Scandinavia to the Samoyeds and various other groups in northwestern Siberia, definitely use it. And these are all groups whose languages derived from a common ancestor. And it's likely that Amanita was used by at least many of these older populations. And then you can find it in the far east of Siberia among groups that are sometimes called Paleo-Siberian. This map has it as the Chukotka-Kamchatkan language family. These are language families. And that's all broken up then by Indo-European languages in the west, and in the east, Altaic languages are green on the map. That includes Mongolian, all the Turkic languages, the Tungus languages like Manchu, and the like. Some of these are major languages. Many of them are small tribal languages. And the map shows the period before Russian colonization. So Russian is the dominant language over most of that region today. I also show the Altai Mountains, so that's presumably where these languages originated, with one common group, or at least that's what used to be thought, and then which then spread, some going southwest, some going south, some going southeast, some going north, and moving into Siberia. And by this thesis, the Altaic people did not use Amanita muscaria. They came into an area where it was used, but they didn't adapt that custom. There is a problem, though, with this. Recent research has showed that Altaic is not a real language family. By that I mean all these languages are not descended from one common ancestral language, but rather came to acquire many similarities due to connections with other groups speaking different languages. People borrow and share all kinds of linguistic elements with their neighbors, words, sounds, grammatical structures even. And how the research went in determining this is that in a real language family, like Indo-European, sort of pinkish color there, When you go back in time and find earlier texts, you find that languages are more similar. In other words, Sanskrit is more similar to Latin and ancient Greek than Hindi is to modern Italian or contemporary Greek. In other words, languages have over time have separated, but originally they could be traced back to one proto-language. And the problem with Altaic is when you look at the earliest Turkic and Mongolic texts, the languages are more dissimilar rather than more similar, which would indicate they came to share their features. So anyway, there's a lot of uncertainty about this, and we can't really explain that distributional pattern. But what we can say is that for a lot of these older Siberian peoples, Amanita muscaria was and is to this day very important. So the Koryaks live in the Far East. They have a religion based on animism or shamanism. Their shamans or shamans are very important. And note here from an article from Psychedelic Spotlight that according to Koryak folklore, the Amanita muscaria was a sacred gift from Big Raven, who was the first shaman and the causal beginning of the human race. And the Koryak took a special interest in Amanita muscaria, made it a central pillar of their folklore, ritual, and even day-to-day life. So this is a culture that was and has been highly focused on this one particular psychoactive substance. Now, I mentioned before about not necessarily in a pleasant manner. So Amanita muscaria mushrooms are relatively rare, but the drug can be recycled. Here's just a quote from this article. Beside the conventional method of ingesting the mushroom, the shamans also have a slightly off-the-beaten path approach to maximizing the effect. A shaman will consume a mushroom, urinate after a reasonable amount of time has passed, and the followers would share and drink the urine. Urine is completely safe to drink. It has no bacteria or other issues. And actually there are people who do drink urine supposedly for health purposes, although it is quite off-putting. But like I say, it's a rare mushroom, and if you wanted to have the broader community have use to it, you had to have this kind of expedient. I don't think there's any evidence of this in the West. There's been a lot written on Amanita muscaria, and all the way back in 1968, the pioneering ethnomycologist, which means student of ethnic uses of fungi, R. Gordon Wasson, wrote a book called Soma, the Divine Mushroom of Immortality. Now, I talked in a previous lecture on the lost psychoactive substance, Soma of the Rig Veda, the most ancient of the Hindu epics, and Hauma of the Avesta, the ancient Zoroastrian sacred text. Where a certain psychoactive substance was extremely important, even really divine, especially in the Rig Veda, and nobody knows what it was. So Wasson said, well, it's Amanita muscaria. To read from the back cover, one of the key enigmas of cultural history has been the identity of the sacred plant called Soma. Mr. Wasson has aroused considerable attention in learned circles and beyond by advancing and documenting the thesis that Soma was a hallucinogenic mushroom, none other than Amanita muscaria or the fly agaric. Until recently, the center of shamanic rituals among Siberian and Uralic tribesmen. As I mentioned in the previous lecture, this thesis is lost ground. I don't really find it credible. You can go back and read some things in the Rig Veda that seem to fit. We have drunk the Soma, we have become immortal, we have gone to the light, we have found the gods. But then there are other ones that are, well, to quote from it, these glorious drops that give me freedom I have drunk. Closely they knit my joints as straps secure a car. That car should actually be translated as chariot. Let them protect my foot from slipping the way. This is not a description of a hallucinogenic substance. It's more of a description of a stimulant like ephedra. There are many, many other speculations of other people using it. Among the ancient Celtic people of Western and Central Europe, the Druids were a very important priestly caste. There are a lot of legends about the Druids. I think most of what we know comes from Julius Caesar's account of his conquest of Gaul, which is probably certainly not the most disinterested work on it, although a very important work in its own right. So we certainly know the Druids were extremely important. Speculated they engaged in human sacrifice and various other sorts of things. It's really hard to say. They certainly had sacred oak groves, and their importance is undoubted. But were they using Amanita muscaria? Here's an quote from an article. Ancient Celtic Druids would consume these mushrooms, which they call the flesh of the gods, help them gain access to other states of consciousness to gain a deeper spiritual connection, which they would then share with others in the community. It's quite possible. Firm evidence is lacking, however. But that doesn't stop scholars from going into folklore, myths, legends, and so on, and try to find a connection. So it has been suggested that the ancient Celtic fire goddess Brigid was associated with Amanita. Brigid, it's important to note, was a Celtic goddess who, after the Christianization of Ireland, became associated with a Christian saint, Saint Brigid. So Saint Brigid is still extremely important. And there are big debates over what are the connections between Brigid as a Catholic saint and as a pre-Christian Celtic goddess. But an interesting article from the Journal of Psychedelic Studies on Amanita muscaria, mythology and pharmacology, and they quote another scholar and state, Peter McCoy examined the myth to reveal the association of Amanita muscaria with the red-headed Celtic goddess Brigid, known as the goddess of prophecy and healing, and for the inspiration of poets and spiritual leaders. Even with the Romanization, and I should say to Christianization, of Celtic culture, many key Amanita features of Brigid remain in descriptions that reveal the appearance, growth patterns, and others characteristic of the mushroom. And some would go on well beyond that to say, well, there are all kinds of lasting Irish cultural associations between mushrooms, and some would say particularly Amanita, with leprechauns, fairies, and this whole folklore issue. A lot of real uncertainty here. Yes, associations with mushrooms, but there are all kinds of mushrooms. Amanita is just one of them, and it's important not to overgeneralize. And some scholars have taken this in other directions, for example, suggesting that Viking berserkers, who were warriors who were noted to go into battle frenzy, as sort of insane, delirious war charges, they're well authenticated in the literature, so there's no doubt there were Viking berserkers who often dressed in animal skins and were very feared. And so this was, linkage was first suggested as early as 1784. I find it highly unlikely. Going berserk in a battle rage when you're hallucinating is unlikely. Now, it's possible they took moderate doses that did not involve hallucinations. And the ibotenic acid, which is a stimulant, may be as useful for this sort of thing, but the muscimol, the more important substance, is a depressant, and it would not be very useful in this. It's also suggested that early Christians consumed Amanita muscaria. Again, I say probably not. But a book was published, The Sacred Mushroom and the Cross, arguing, as the author argues, through etymology, that the roots of Christianity lay in fertility cults and cult practices, such as ingesting visionary plants to perceive the mind of God. And he claims this persisted all the way into the early Christian era, up even into the 13th century. And as evidence, he points to a fresco and a European chapel, a medieval chapel. And there's the fresco. And if you look at the caps, they look a lot like Amanita muscaria, but that is not at all how mushrooms grow. Mushrooms do not grow in a branching pattern. Anyone who's seen mushrooms would realized that that just doesn't work. And there has been work suggesting that trees were often depicted in medieval art in sort of a mushroom form. So I'm very skeptical of that thesis. But then this begs the question, though, why is Amanita so ubiquitously portrayed in popular culture? It's everywhere. And yes, in pop culture like Super Mario Brothers, who powers up with Amanita muscaria. To quote from the illustration here, the mushrooms from the Mario Brothers games are based on real mushrooms with psychedelic effects that make it feels like you are growing in size when consumed. Oh, I'll get back to that. Not exactly would be my response. But even the Smurfs live in Amanita muscaria houses. So, is this some deep cultural memory of a time when many of our ancestors consumed Amanita or muscaria when it was very important to their religious life and ritual activities? Or maybe it's just because these mushrooms are so striking and so beautiful. Do a search of mushrooms, and you're probably going to get more photos of Amanita than anything else, even though it's a relatively uncommon mushroom. It just sort of become iconic. And this also ties in with Alice in Wonderland. Because in Alice in Wonderland, mushroom features prominently. There's a hookah smoking caterpillar on it, but actually in the original text, the mushroom species was not specified. So it's illustrators and later interpreters of Alice in Wonderland who've claimed that this is an Amanita mushroom. Here's a whole article on it. Amanita muscaria, the real mushroom we know from Disney movies. And to quote it, the spirit of the fly agaric is perhaps best captured in Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland. The caterpillar sits on an unidentified mushroom and tells Alice to nibble on one side to make her grow tall, while taking a bite from the other to make her shrink. So this is linked to what is actually called the Alice in Wonderland syndrome, or Todd syndrome, or Lilliputian hallucination. So this is an actual psychological designation. And the Alice in Wonderland syndrome results in people appearing objects to be much larger or become larger, or to become much smaller, this growing and shrinking in size. To quote Wikipedia, along with the size, mass, and shape distortions of the body, those with Alice in Wonderland syndrome often experience a feeling of disconnection from their own body, feelings, thoughts, and environment. It's described as being an observer completely outside of their own actions and behaviors. So this is what results from dissociative drugs like PCP or ketamine. And sometimes Amanita is put in that dissociative category because of this idea that one becomes disconnected from one's thoughts. There's a real problem with that, certainly in my own recent experience of watching these trip reports on Amanita muscaria. That was not something that most of the people taking it experienced. It just wasn't in these reports. And it's probably much more likely that the Alice in Wonderland syndrome reflects Lewis Carroll's own personal experiences with migraine headaches. So to quote an article here, his diary reveals that he consulted an ophthalmologist about the visual manifestations of the migraines he regularly experienced. He wrote of bilious headaches that were coupled with nausea and vomiting, but also that he had experienced the odd optical illusion of seeing moving fortifications followed by a headache. So he perhaps had migraine hallucinations. And if you're interested in this phenomenon, I highly recommend Oliver Sacks' book called Hallucinations. Sacks was a medical doctor and a literary writer, wrote many books on his experience as a psychoanalyst with bizarre cases. I think his first best-known book may be the Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat, if I'm recalling correctly. But Hallucinations, he talks a lot about his own experiences, both in taking just about any kind of drug he could find for a while, but also having severe migraines. And I would note that I also experienced the Alice in Wonderland syndrome at one time, macropsia, things becoming much larger than their actual size. I was 6 years old. I had meningitis and was on death's door. But it's a distinct and rather horrifying memory I have of that experience. Uh, so anyway, if you go to these Amanita trip reports where people took what psychonauts, self-styled psychonauts, called heroic doses, yeah, you can find heaven, you can find hell, but I didn't find any little people or any leprechauns or these sort of experiences that are supposedly associated with it. An even more controversial thesis is the Santa Claus and Amanita connection. We can see illustrated here with Santa with a couple of mushrooms here. Now, many, both scholars and journalists, have suggested a close connection. Find articles like Amanita Muscari and Santa Claus, the psychedelic history of Old Saint Nick, and what does Santa have to do with psychedelic mushrooms? When Santa was a mushroom, Amanita Muscari and the origins of Christian, and did shrooms send Santa and his reindeer flying on NPR? So the idea here is that Santa Claus legend, and I should say it's not the St. Nicholas legend, it's particularly the Santa Claus legend, which has then been associated with St. Nicholas, who was an early Christian saint, I think in the 4th century, living in what is now Turkey. So that's completely different. But the Santa thing, has been linked to the Sami, it used to be called Lap people of northern Scandinavia. The Sami were, to a very large extent still are, reindeer pastoralists, so they live up in the far north tundra region. Agriculture is essentially impossible, but reindeer, same species as caribou, were domesticated long ago, thrive in that environment. So the Sami would follow their reindeer herds. In the summer live in tents. I believe they had winter lodges. But this fits many parts of the legend, certainly the polar location, the reindeer, and even the flying reindeer, because Amanita muscari is hallucinogenic, and one can hallucinate things like flying reindeer. And it's even been suggested that Santa's descent down the chimney was linked to a Sami custom where the shaman would climb down the tent posts, or I read one source that said, well, in the winter the snow can be very, very high, and you'd go down in your lodge through the through the top. Certainly Santa's color scheme, this is reflected here, the red and the white, fits pretty well. So you might wonder, well, how could this idea from this pretty obscure tribal pastoralist people and the tundras of far northern Scandinavia, how could this have entered the European cultural imagination? Well, if it did, if this thesis is correct, it would have almost been certainly from early English traders going to Russia. Until the period of Peter the Great in the early 18th century, Russia had no connection to the Baltic Sea, or not much of one. And so when the English founded the Muscovy Company in the in the early 1600s, they were trading earlier in the 1500s. They would sail around Scandinavia and go down into the White Sea to the port of Archangel. And this was an important and well-documented trade for a long period of time. So in the voyages to this region, they would have quite likely come into contact with the Sami and their shamans. Now, I should note there's been a lot of criticism of this from the Sami themselves and from scholars. To quote a National Geographic article, the story of Santa emerging from Sami shamanic tradition has been criticized, has a critical number of flaws, asserts a professor, and the theory has been widely criticized by the Sami people as stereotypical and a problematic, romanticized misreading of their actual culture. So I would note there are some objections to this thesis. I have to say, though, I find it somewhat compelling, because how else can you explain the flying reindeer and so many other aspects of the Santa Claus legend? It's certainly not coming out of a Christian tradition. and it fits pretty nicely with the Amanita thesis. So uh, take what you will out of this. As far as the current situation, Amanita is legal in the United States unless you're in Louisiana, the only state that has made it illegal. So you can get it. You can, if you are interested in taking it. I should say I have not taken it. When I was developing this lecture in the spring, I thought, well, I really, I should take some if I'm going to talk about it. I should know what its effects are in a personal way. And so I thought about doing this, but didn't get around to it. I still might in the future. If I were to do so, I would not take a microdose. I've taken microdoses of some psychedelic substances and found no effect whatsoever. I might take a lower moderate dose. You can see a moderate dose, according to Amanita Explorer, results in profound euphoria or dysphoria. In other words, you may be very happy or very unhappy. If you do a high dose or a heroic dose, a potential for spiritual experience or significant distress, and then a very high dose, potential for poisoning. Yeah, not advised at all. But these are available online. You can purchase the mushrooms, you can purchase gummies. But as Amanita Explorer will tell you, it's a tricky sort of thing. It's really best to use the actual mushrooms themselves, but preparation is very important. Remember, there's ibotenic acid in these mushrooms, and that is somewhat toxic. So I would just say be careful if you want to do this. So I'll move on to the second half of the lecture now, the solanaceous hallucinogens. By solanaceous, I'm referring to a plant family, the Solanaceae. There are some 2,700 species. We know many of them at a close, detailed level, like tomatoes, potatoes, eggplant, bell peppers, chili peppers. Very important foods, but the Solanaceae family has many potent alkaloids. And, grow tomatoes in an area where there are a lot of deer, and you'll find the deer are not going to eat the leaves. They may eat almost everything else, but they're going to leave these solanaceous plants alone in general because the leaves are toxic. And actually, tomatoes were probably domesticated from a plant that had a lot of toxins in it, and then they were bred to get rid of all those toxic substances. So anyway, there are 4 plants within this family that were used widely in the Eastern Hemisphere, and in the case of Datura in the Western Hemisphere as well, by shamans and others, and by medical practitioners. Like I say, they're all highly psychoactive, highly dangerous, and also highly useful. But anyway, these are henbane, deadly nightshade, mandrake, and datura. They have the same alkaloids in them in different combinations, and there are other alkaloids too. But these are the 3 main psychoactive ones: scopolamine, atropine, and hyoscyamine. So they're all psychoactive, hallucinogenic in the right dose. They're all very dangerous and all very useful. Their biochemistry is well understood. They're anticholinergic drugs, so they block acetylcholine, a neurotransmitter at synapses. So, a lot of these psychoactive substances, the actual mechanisms are very complex, and there's a lot of research being done on them, and scientists are figuring them out. But this seems to be a relatively straightforward case. What these anticholinergic drugs do is inhibit the parasympathetic nervous system. So you have these sort of parallel nervous systems, the sympathetic nervous system, which is associated with the fight or freeze mechanism. So it increases your heart rate and your respiratory rate and your blood pressure, and dilates your pupils, and it really decreases the digestion and urine production. And then you have the parasympathetic nervous system, sometimes called as rest and digest, or even feed and breed activities. So it increases digestion, it decreases heart rate and respiratory rate, and the like. So anyway, these solanaceous plants and the drugs they contain inhibit that parasympathetic nervous system. So inhibits things like salivation and tears, urination, digestion, defecation, and so on. I'll go through all three of these drugs. Scopolamine is a hallucinogen, they all are in the right doses, and a powerful deliriant. It's associated with hypnotic effects like twilight sleep, and it's a powerful antiemetic. In other words, it reduces nausea and vomiting, which is its main medical use. It's also been described as the world's most dangerous drug. There are a lot of reports of Colombian criminal gangs drugging their victims with scopolamine before they rob them, kidnap them, rape them, or whatever horrific things they have in mind. So we have an article here from Science Explorer. Scopolamine, is this mind-controlled drug the most dangerous in the world? Or something called North Point, the devil's breath, why scopolamine abuse is so terrifying. And The Guardian reporting devil's breath. These are just common terms for scopolamine. Can it really zombify you? Well, no, it can't turn you into a zombie. Is it a mind-controlled drug? Well, not exactly, but it can definitely incapacitate a person, put them in this twilight sleep state, and allow the perpetrators to more easily victimize them. It's certainly used medically, usually in patches. Patches are important because we get a very regular, slow dose coming in. So it's used for, to avoid motion sickness, but also for gastrointestinal spasms and irritable bowel and syndrome and all sorts of other things. Some problematic side effects, to be sure. So if you go to the medical literature and you see the most common is agitation. Remember, the parasympathetic nervous system is all about rest and digest. So we're getting rid of the rest, just agitation. But incidents can also include burning feeling while urinating. And I have to say, in watching these trip reports on people who've taken these solanaceous substances, it's very common to report problems of feeling like I have to pee, but I can't, and that is a problem with it. Delusions of persecution, mistrust, suspiciousness, or combativeness, so it can generate paranoia. And then at the bottom, seeing, hearing, or feeling things that are not there. In other words, hallucinations. Atropine is also very useful. Note that it's used to treat some urinary disorders, but then bottom you can see one of the adverse effects is urinary as well. But another adverse effect, delirium, hallucination, the same sort of thing. So atropine is used to treat poisoning by nerve agents and a number of pesticides. Very effective in that regard. Used to be used a lot to dilate the pupils. I don't think they're doing it that much. And can be used in surgery if the heart rate goes too low. You can speed it up. And if you're interested in why it counteracts some poisons, this explains it. So pesticides like the organophosphates inhibit a certain enzyme breaking down acetylcholine, which leads to accumulation of acetylcholine causing overstimulation, and then atropine counteracts it by blocking those receptors, reducing the symptoms. The deadly nightshade, its scientific name is Atropa belladonna. Atropa, atropine, you can see where that comes from. Belladonna quite literally means a beautiful woman. Bella, beautiful, Donna, woman. And supposedly it was once used as a beauty aid. So the common name belladonna originates from its historical use by women. Drops prepared from the belladonna plant were used to dilate pupils, which was considered to be attractive and seductive. Ambrose Bierce, who was a 19th century American wit, humorist, although very, very sardonic, very important literary figure, who wrote a book that's still widely in print called The Devil's Dictionary. I find it very interesting and amusing, but his definition of belladonna is a noun. In Italian, a beautiful lady. In English, a deadly poison. A striking example of the essential identity of the two tongues. It gives you a sense of Ambrose Bierce's view of the world. Pretty misanthropic. Atropine overdoses are well known. Physicians sometimes learn a little saying here that hot as a hair, mad as a hatter, red as a beet, and dry as a bone. Well, if your patient has that, good chance it's atropine overdose. So sweating is cut down, temperature goes up, confusion, delirium, flush face, and very, very dry and thirsty. And how you get these in the trip reports of just unquenchable thirst from taking these. Hyoscine, widely prescribed, more than 900,000 prescriptions in the U.S. Used to relief for spasms caused by various abdominal and bladder disorders. Maybe more important is when combined with opioids, it increases the level of analgesia or pain relief obtained. And interestingly, if we look at the Association of Anesthetists of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, they have this seal and motto. And in the seal, what do you see? You see mandrake roots at the top, and you see opium capsules. So this is it's important to note. I think there's a very common view that until the modern era, the sort of more recent era, late 1800s into the 20th century, that there was really no effective pain relief and surgery. One just had to, bite out leather strap or something and get your arm amputated. Well, that often happened, but medical practitioners had long been using opium, and they had for many, many centuries know that if you combine it with these sort of solanaceous plants that have scopolamine and atropine and hyoscine in them, then you can get a much more effective reduction of pain. And especially with the mandrake, you can go into this kind of twilight sleep. So there's a long history of therapeutic use. A very interesting article I found from a journal called Anesthesiology a few decades back. Was a sort of a historically informed exploration of ethics in anesthesia called The Legacy of Atropos, The Fate Who Cut the Thread of Life. And I found it worthwhile reading, and I'll just read from the beginning of it. Hardly a practitioner of anesthesia begins administration of an anesthetic agent without the ready availability of atropine. Throughout this long history of pain relief, no matter whether the anodyne agent had been ancient or modern, the principle of safeguarding the thread of life has remained the core of practice. The legacy of Atropos, the fate who cut the thread of life, and her namesake roots, Atropa mandragora, mandrake, and Atropa belladonna, deadly nightshade, used as anodyne, soporific, and hallucinogenic agents for millennia, remind us that we practice the art and science of anesthesiology against the backdrop of legendary proportions. Well said. And just to note who Atropos was, a Greek fate or goddess, if you will. So there was these ancient Greek myths about Clotho spinning the thread of life, representing a person's lifespan. Another fate who decides the extent or length, and then Atropos with the shears who cuts it off and ends life. So beware. Several of these solanaceous components of several solanaceous plants and their components were found in two very important, although semi-mythical drugs of antiquity, theriac and mithridate. So theriac was a supposed panacea, meaning cure anything, that the ancient Greeks had and used. It spread to Persia, India, and even China, supposedly. Was often mentioned. Nobody's exactly sure what it was, and it undoubtedly was not a panacea, although it also undoubtedly had certain beneficial effects. Mithridate is even more mythical. It was considered to be a universal poison antidote. Here we have an elaborately gilded jar for storing it, but like I say, did it really exist? Or, well, it certainly was not efficacious. It was never a universal poison antidote. But as far as theriac goes, fairly recently, a couple decades ago, archaeologists uncovered what they believed to be a theriac workshop, where they found residues which had cannabis, opium, henbane, black nightshade, frogs, and toad remains. So an unusual plant and bone assemblage, a lot of amphibian bones here. Yeah, maybe it was the frogs and toads that were that were doing it, but wine was very often, well, it was generally mixed in the ancient Mediterranean world. Ancient Greeks mixed it with water, but it was mixed with a variety of other substances for flavor and sometimes for other sorts of psychoactive or medical effects. And then, as far as Mithridate, this alleged universal poison antidote, that is linked to Mithridates the Sixth, who was the king of Pontus, which is a Black Sea kingdom, greatly expanded under his reign. It was a challenge to Rome in the 1st century BCE. And into the 2nd century BCE as well. You can see he had a long reign. But Mithridates the Sixth was allegedly immune to poison. Yeah, allegedly. The story was his father was poisoned by arsenic. He went into the wilderness, took small doses of arsenic until he was immune to it, and then started doing that with other substances and eventually developed sort of a school of physicians who were trying to create this universal poison antidote, which they certainly did not create, but evidently they tried. And it's very interesting. The Wikipedia says Mithridates' antitoxin routines included religious component, were supervised by the Agari, a group of Scythian shamans who never left him. Now, I talked in a previous lecture about the Enare, another group of Scythian shamans who were noted for their consumption of cannabis and for a transvestite or transgender, if you will, mode of life. I did a bit of research to try to find out more about the Agari and their connection with the Anari. All I was able to find in the time I allotted myself was the Agari were Scythian shamans who were particularly interested in medicine and curative plants. So in the ancient world, solanaceous plants were used for pain and sleep problems. They were also feared, especially mandrake, sometimes treatment for melancholia, depression. Many legends and myths repeated to this day. I really love this illustration. Dioscorides, who was wrote Materia Medica, the most important medical textbook for millennia, really, well, certainly centuries. Ancient Greek scholar and practitioner. Anyway, he is seated in a chair and he receives the mandrake root from Eurasian, the goddess of discovery. I never heard of this goddess until I was preparing for this lecture. But immediately beneath the mandrake, a dog is rearing itself on its hindquarters in extremis after the retrieval of the root. So note the root looks like a human being. The legend was that anyone who pulled up a mandrake root would die, and so dogs would be tied to them, but the dogs would suffer from this because of the magical, mystical properties of the mandrake root. So the mandrake roots sometimes they're forked. They sometimes look a little bit like a human figure. We can see an actual root here. You can see an illustration here of the mandrake root and the little homunculus, the little person underneath it, sort of showing the difficulties associated with this. And like I say, a lot of these sort of things extend into popular culture. Mandrake certainly does. If you've watched the Harry Potter films, one of them in particular, you will note that at Hogwarts, Professor Sprout, who's responsible for teaching potions, is very careful with the mandrake root, which is screaming. Supposedly they would scream when pulled out. Hildegard of Bingen, who I mentioned in a previous lecture, who was a medieval abbess, mystic, musician, scholar, doctor, polymath in many senses. She denounced mandrake. She was sort of afraid of it, but would use it as well. I'm not going to quote that, but I will with belladonna, another very similar plant, closely related, same alkaloids found. And I will quote here on her book, Healing Plants, or a section on healing plants from her medieval classic, Physica. In the earth and place where it grows, diabolical influence has some part and union in its craft. It, in other words, meaning belladonna, is harmful for a person to eat or drink because it agitates the spirit. Well, that it does. Just as if the person were dead. Nevertheless, the skin and flesh are perforated with great and if the skin and flesh are perforated with great and piercing ulcers, let a person take a little goose fat and as much deer or goat tallow as he or she can get. Add a bit, just a single drop of belladonna juice. Mix this together and make an ointment. And I will see later on that ointments can be the most efficient way of taking these sort of medications, and often the safest way. And Hildegard had good reason for caution. And I'll just quote the Wikipedia. Sometimes it's better to quote these rather than to try to remember all of the effects. But the hallucinogenic experience and delirium produced by these agents is characterized by stupor, agitation, confusion, confabulation, emotional bluntness, dysphoria, memory deficits, incoherency of thought, hypo or hyperactivity, mixed delirium, lucid intervals, inability to sit still, realistic visual hallucinations or illusions, as opposed to the pseudo hallucinations or lucid hallucinations experienced by psychedelics, other classes of hallucinogens, and regression to phantom behavior such as disrobing, plucking, or interacting with imaginary objects and scenes. The subject has minimal control over their actions and may have little or no recollection of the experience afterwards. So this is something that you can see very clearly in going and watching on YouTube these trip reports from Arrowwood. I mean, some of them are just staggeringly disconcerting and frightful, because people who have taken especially high doses of something like datura, they'll often end up hurting themselves, even killing themselves. You know, they're convinced that there's something on their skin, and they start pulling at it and plucking it, and end up causing severe damage to themselves. So these are dangerous substances, and as Hildegard of Bingen knew, as medical practitioners knew from millennia ago, they're very useful but very dangerous as well. And the last slide, or second to last here, is on a short revival of scopolamine for anesthesia circa 1900, and this came from Germany, where German doctors were using it for delivery of babies, because it would result in twilight sleep, an amnesiac state characterized by insensitivity to pain with or without the loss of consciousness, induced by an injection of morphine and scopolamine with the purpose of pain management during childbirth. And you could see the spread to the United States for a certain period of time. Eventually, more effective and less dangerous methods of reducing pain in childbirth were developed. I should note there are many midwives and physicians who avoid all of those sorts of medications with childbirth. That's a topic I won't get into. But with scopolamine mixed with opium to manage childbirth, well, it's difficult to get the dose right. And they also required very careful environmental management. You needed the women to be under sensory deprivation so that they wouldn't have intense hallucinations, which, if it's a hallucination and you're not aware it's a hallucination, you're giving birth, yeah, that is problematic, to say the least. So it didn't last very long. At any rate, my next lecture will be the part 2 of Eurasian Hallucinogens. I'll talk about a ritual and recreational use of deliriants, and then I'll talk about the use of ergot, very similar to LSD in the ancient world. Very controversial subject, but a lot of research is being done on this. So I hope you can tune into that, and we come to the end of this lecture. Thank you for listening.